Find new seasonal favorites right now at Hobby Lobby, where fall decor is 50% off. You'll find
When my water broke at 17.5 weeks, I found out I was going to lose my daughter. And my Missouri doctors weren't allowed to give me the care that I needed, all because of the mandate Eric Schmidt put into place. Eric Schmidt doesn't care about women like me. Imposing a mandate that doesn't have exceptions for rape, incest, or help a mother, and it could even send women and doctors to jail. It's just too extreme.
I'm Trudy Bush Valentine, and I approve this message.
Hey, Matt.
Good evening, everyone. We'll call this meeting to order of the Legislative and Advocacy Committee. Thank you. We have a special presentation tonight by the St. Louis Research Practice Collaborative. After that, we will go over rather briefly our legislative platform, as well as our priorities and some suggestions for recommendations to the board to vote. Board will need to vote on that in November. So if we want to go over that tonight and see if we can come to a consensus about recommended changes. We have some special guests here tonight up at the dais. So as we normally do, if we can just go down the line and introduce ourselves and say what you do.
Good evening. I am Dr. Deidre Thomas Murray. I coordinate homeless and foster care services for the district, where we have consistently served over 5,000 students.
Alana Parks, the Director of the Office of Family and Community Engagement for the district.
Lori Willis, Deputy Superintendent for Institutional Advancement for St. Louis Public Schools.
Byron Clemens, the Communications Specialist and Community Liaison for AFT 420. Patrick Charles, Vice President of Political Education for AFT 420, and I'm also a teacher at Sumner High School.
Good evening, I'm Nicole Williams. I serve as the Chief of Staff here in the St. Louis Public Schools.
Jamie Manger, I'm the Interim General Counsel for St. Louis Public Schools.
Charles Burton, Chief Human Resource Officer, St. Louis Public Schools.
Well, thank you. Well, if we can begin with the presentation. I should add on the line is Dr. Adams as well as Steve Carroll of Carroll Associates, our lobbyist. So they are tuning in.
So good evening, everyone. I know we're in the process of pulling up the PowerPoint, but I can say good evening and welcome. It's an honor and privilege to be here. My name is Nicole Williams. I serve as the Chief of Staff here in the St. Louis Public Schools, and I also serve as the co-chair for the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative. I always add schools to that acronym. I know it's SRPC, but I add the S because it is about schools. So I do want to take a moment and just thank our board president and chair of the Advocacy and Legislative Ad Hoc Committee, Mr. Matt Davis, for the invitation this evening for our team to present some critical information about the St. Louis Research Practice Collaborative, research for schools, and specifically the pilot mobility study. So the goal really is of the St. Louis Research Practice Collaborative to develop impactful research collaborations between researchers and school practitioners so that every child in the St. Louis region schools have access to excellent educational supports and opportunities. So we're going to take some time this afternoon to really talk about what that means for the work that we do every day here in St. Louis Public Schools with the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative. The goal is to answer questions, problems of practice around research through a rigorous research agenda. So let me take a couple of moments to just frame our core objectives this evening. My task is to frame the what. What is the SRPC, the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative, in the context of an RPP, a research practice partnership? The why. Why does the SRPC exist and the benefits to our schools? And then certainly the how. How do we do business? How do we engage in partnership in a very intentional way? So our core objectives this evening for the Ad Hoc Committee members is to really support and deepen the understanding of what an RPP is in the context of our St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative, which is our local RPP. We're going to spend some time just providing the committee with some in-depth data, quantitative data, descriptive data specific to the problem of practice around mobility. and that's student mobility data within a statewide context. And then finally, our goal is to engage in robust conversation this evening with the committee to discuss policy implications and other data needs. So let me frame for you the agenda this evening and take a moment to introduce our team members who will take us through this very intentional and thoughtful presentation. To meet the objectives of our meeting this evening, I'll handle the first part of the agenda, which is all about the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative, the SRPC. I'm going to take a moment to introduce Ms. Dorothy Rhodey Collins, who's in the audience this evening. Dorothy, you can just wave, and she's going to share and frame some of the benefits of this partnership to our St. Louis Public Schools. And then I'm going to have a colleague, Dr. Deanna Childress. You can wave, Dr. Childress. She's going to really take us through the quantitative data, the metrics, and talk a little bit about what this pilot mobility study looks like, feels like, sounds like, in the work that we're doing. And then finally, Mr. Jay Hartman. Jay, would you wave to us for us? He's going to talk about future work and implications and engage us in a robust discussion around the policy implications for this work. We know data is a powerful information to inform our practice and to inform our work. And so the pilot study is really a preliminary data to get some context and to understand the work of an RPP. Let me set the stage for our collaborative discussion. You'll hear from us, but our goal is to engage you in robust discussion. So the expectations for participation this evening is throughout the presentation, we're going to ask you to provide your thinking, to share your thoughts, to engage us in questions and to kind of frame any clarifying questions that you might have. This is going to be a dialogue, not a monologue, but a dialogue. So we invite your voices into this conversation as we co-create the ways that we work together to understand the data that's being shared. I'd like you to take a look at the definition on the screen. This is an RPP, so there are a lot of acronyms, and my goal is to unpack those acronyms so we have a common understanding, common language to understand the work that we're engaged in. Take a look at the definition. Is there a word or phrase on that screen that really resonates with you? Let me give you a moment to read it. Anyone want to offer a word or phrase that resonates with you as you look at the core work of an RPP, a research practice partnership?
The first word that popped out for me was intentional.
Intentional, thank you. Others? Joint effort. Anything else that's really bubbling up for you as you look at this definition of a research practice partnership as defined by the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships? What really resonates with me is this idea of impacting decision-making in education. We call it the nexus of research and practice. So as we think about an RPP, the work is really about bringing together researchers, practitioners to really understand the problem of practice that practitioners are concerned about. And in this case, mobility is the area that we'll be talking about this evening. The partnership should improve the lives of the students we serve. That should be the goal of the work. And really, it frames our why for why St. Louis Public Schools are engaged in this work. Our decision should be based in research and practice and evidence. So let me give you a quick orientation to our local RPP, our Research Practice Partnership. Our local RPP is the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative. So the name of the RPP and the work that's being done, it's a partnership, right? It's intentional. It centers the voices of practitioners. It really embodies the definition of an RPP. When we think about this cross-section, if you will, or cross-sector of collaborators in St. Louis, in the St. Louis region, we have several local universities involved in the development of the problem of practice of mobility, specifically Washington University, St. Louis University, University of Missouri, St. Louis, and Harris-Stowe. Those universities are intentionally and have been intentionally involved at the inception of in this particular problem of practice of mobility. We also have 3 local educational agencies, LEAs. The largest LEA is St. Louis Public Schools. We are the largest LEA in the city of St. Louis. We also have KIPP, charter schools, and Confluence Academies. And once again, the core purpose of this is to really understand and center the voices of the practitioners who are doing this work each and every day in schools so that we can answer problems of practice that better the lives of the students that we serve. So I realize that the slide before you is, there's a lot going on. So let me take a couple of moments to unpack it. We know that when we have relationships and partnerships, it's important to have a structure that is intentional and formalized. And so this structure is intentionally formalized because it really speaks to the joint efforts that are taking place with our research practice collaborative. If you take a look at the advisory council, there are 13 members in the advisory council. I just want to highlight a few of those members who are in the room this evening. I serve as the co-chair to the St. Louis Schools Research Practice Collaborative in collaboration with my colleague, Dr. Andrew Butler from Washington University. He's a professor there, as well as the education department chair. We have several other team members in this room who are part of the advisory council. Once again, I just want to recognize Jay Hartman, who is our executive director for the St. Louis Consortium Partnership Network. Dr. Deborah Schmidt, she's not in the room this evening. However, Dr. Schmidt is an SLPS social studies teacher. She is an AFT St. Louis Local 420 member, and she serves as part of the advisory council. We also have several other team members who are critical to this work. The advisory council, the core purpose of the advisory council is to advise on key research projects, specifically this evening, the mobility study, and to work together to share feedback and develop solutions with respect to the school systems that are involved, the LEAs that are involved in this work. And finally, we're tasked right now in determining, we're still in our infancy stage, so we're tasked in determining the permanent managing entity after the first year. Let me just unpack for you the interim management team that is currently governing, working to support this work. Dr. Saris Chung is in the audience this evening. Saris, if you'll raise your hand. She's the executive director of SCIP Designed. And SCIP Designed is really a think tank that co-designs system level strategies with key stakeholders. So the role is to really support the co-creation and collaboration that takes place. We also have Rachel Matsumoto in the audience, and she is intentional about so many things, but I do want to just acknowledge Rachel for the work that she does with SCIP Design, but also the work that she does in leading and supporting our SRPC. And then if you'll look at the bottom of the SRPC structure, you'll see that there are 3 core committees doing this work. I want to recognize some of the team members who are here this evening. Our data committee, we have several co-chairs, 2 co-chairs of the data committee, and the purpose of the data committee is really to support a streamlined and robust system of integrated data for education in the St. Louis region. The Student Mobility Committee, there are 2 co-chairs on that Student Mobility Committee, but there are several members in the audience who serve on that committee. I want to recognize Alana Parks. Once again, she's the SLPS Director of Family and Community Engagement. Dr. Deanna Childress, who also serves on that committee, and Dr. Deborah Schmidt, as well as many other team members from the LEAs and the research institutions. And finally, we have the Knowledge Committee. The Knowledge Committee, there are two co-chairs. The Knowledge Committee is focused on designing and implementing pathways for practitioners to deeply engage in research. You'll hear from my colleague, Dr. Well, she'll soon to be Dr. Dorothy Rhodey Collins. We speak it, right? And she's working as a doctoral student at SLU. And she'll talk a little bit about some of the work that's happening, particularly the benefits to SLPS to be part of this robust partnership. Again, the work is, the structure of this work, the governance structure of this work is critically important. I do also want to recognize that we've been very intentional in formalizing the processes and the procedures and how this is governed. And so here in SLPS, we actually have a memorandum of understanding that is specifically designed to govern how we interact with the St. Louis Research Practice Collaborative. The work is fully supported and approved by our school board. So I'd like to just step back for a moment and reiterate the why. The why is so important, understanding and connecting to the why. As you recall, I talked a little bit about the importance of this mission critical work and how an RPP is intentionally formalized structure to impact decision-making. As you see in this mission, the SRPC's mission, our local RPP is really focused on how we inform policies and practice, which is part of the work of our advocacy, legislative advocacy committee, but informing policies and practices that foster systemic improvements in educational, social, and emotional growth for students in St. Louis public schools and St. Louis City. And I'd like to just highlight that we do this by a very intentional transformative power, if you will, of creating collaborations between researchers and practitioners. And you'll hear more about that as we continue this presentation this evening. Conducting very rigorous, relevant research for practice, centering the voices and expertise of our practitioners in this very important, we say, mission critical work. So that's the what, the why, and the how of the SRPC and the RPP. Once again, acronyms that I hope you understand at the conclusion of this presentation this evening. But the centering of our voices, of our practitioners, is so critical to how we do this work as an organization, and certainly how we engage in this partnership. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions specifically about the SRPC mission, vision, the core purpose, sort of the what, why, and how of the work that we do. Ms. Willis, did you have a question, comment?
I was saying I was looking forward to hearing it because you set it up so very nicely. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. So seeing no questions at this time, what I'd like to do is turn it over to my colleague, Dorothy Rhodey Collins, who will take us through just framing the benefits of this partnership to the St. Louis Public Schools. I'm going to be respectful, Dorothy, and just wipe off the mic, if that's okay. I know, but. I should have turned it off before I wiped.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dorothy Rhodey Collins, and I currently serve as the Knowledge Engagement Co-Chair for the St. Louis Research Practice Collaborative. As Dr. Williams mentioned, I'm also in my final year of coursework at SLU in the Education Policy and Equity PhD program. But I came to the SRPC through another means, and that was during my time on the Board of Education of the City of St. Louis. So as I know many of you know, I served a 4-year term on the Board of Education from 2017 to 2021, including 3 years as president. And so that really coincided with how I came to be on the SRPC. So in January 2021, the SRPC was just beginning its design phase, and I was asked to participate as a representative for the Board of Education. But at that same time, the school district and the board was in the process of identifying which schools to permanently close. We were in the process of reopening safe school environments for staff and students, and I was truly desperate for good quality data, rigorous research that we could use to inform the board's practice, the policies that we were implementing or asking the school district to implement. And it was a very frustrating situation to be in, because not only was it hard to access some of that data, but then being able to find St. Louis specific data that we could take and say, okay, this is what's going on in St. Louis. This is what we understand about our city or the current issue. And that just did not exist at the time. So while I came to be on this, part of this collaborative through my time on the board, I continue to be involved now. And in fact, in pursuing a PhD for the same reasons of trying to get information, data, and research into the hands of the people who need it. And that's what I see truly as the benefit of the SRPC, not only to SLPS, but to the city as a whole. So I'll take you through a little bit more about the SRPC and how we work with SLPS and what benefit that may serve. So this is a visual of how the SRPC operates. So again, intending to get research and information back into the hands of the people who need it. So the practitioners are really what is driving a lot of this process. So throughout all of the stages of the SRPC, as Dr. Williams mentioned, we have SLPS practitioners involved. And so they are driving the development of the research questions, the research process, saying what's important to us, how do we figure out a way to get better outcomes for students and their families in the district as a whole, as well as the entire public education system in the city of St. Louis. So that information goes to the researchers who are able to use their expertise and conduct rigorous research and then put that back into the practitioners. And this is a cycle that will continue over time as we engage in additional research projects beyond just the pilot project of student mobility. So there are three core benefits that we see between the SRPC and St. Louis Public Schools, but also truly the entire public education system in the city of St. Louis benefits from this. We are just the largest, or SLPS is just the largest stakeholder in that because of the number of students that the district serves. So research practice partnerships are common in major cities. This is not something that is a brand new idea that's being tested here in St. Louis. If anything, we are a little bit behind the times bringing in a research practice partnership between schools and research institutions. So three of the other cities that we look to for inspiration and in some cases consulted with were Chicago, Baltimore, and Houston, who have large very active research practice partnerships and have a long history with those in their cities. Baltimore is probably the most similar to what we're doing here, in that they are multi-institutional and are engaging with multiple research institutions. The second benefit that we heard very loud and clear as we engage with practitioners over the summer when we were rolling out some of this research and additional research was that SLPS and the public education system operates within a much larger context that is affected by all of these external phenomena. So we know that schools and school leaders and teachers cannot solve all of the problems that enter into our schools or into the public education system. And so the research practice partnership is an opportunity to look at some of those larger phenomena and put that information back into schools and try to have a better way of addressing these issues beyond just any individual school or any individual teacher trying to make things better for their students. Research practice partnerships also help distribute this research work across many people and across many institutions. So the process of research can feel long, it can feel tedious, it can feel boring and stressful, right? And we know that people working inside of schools and inside of school districts have millions of other things to be doing, in addition to trying to identify the right research-based practices. So this allows some of that work to shift to research institutions, to researchers who do this all day, every day, And then give once that long process of research is over, putting it back to the practitioners. And so we're sharing the work, trying to identify these larger phenomena that are affecting schools, and kind of just spreading that out a little bit. So there isn't any one individual or one institution that's being tasked with solving all of these problems. So how did we come to study student mobility? In the early phases of the design council for the SRPC, there was a discussion about what is the first project. So we have all these institutions, we have all these LEAs, what are we going to do first? And so student mobility came about because it is an issue that affects every single school in St. Louis. It affects every single teacher. It affects every single family. And so trying to be intentional about selecting a project that would be beneficial to everyone seemed like a really great way to build this relationship and build the structure of an SRPC. So there is some national research on student mobility that I'll share with you. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Childress, who's going to talk specifically about the local context here. But what we know, there are three big themes that emerge across the national research. And that's mobility in almost every form is harmful, not only for the students who leave and move and have to find a new school, but it's also harmful to the students who stay. It's difficult to build a school culture or a classroom culture when you have children moving in and out. It's difficult for teachers as well. We also know that mobility is not just homelessness, and it's not just the choice moves that we think about sometimes in St. Louis as people are shopping around for schools. So it is homelessness, it is shopping for schools, and it's also policy. Things like eviction, housing, all kinds of other policies impact the student mobility patterns that we see. So there are three areas where the SRPC is looking into the St. Louis context, but here's what we know nationally about students, practitioners, and the districts that house both of those things. So we know there are academic and other student outcomes that are affected, such as graduation rates, reading scores, and things like that. We know that it's difficult for peers to form relationships when students are moving in and out. And we also know it's difficult for them to form relationships with their teachers or the other adults in the school building. So teachers very loudly and clearly over the summer, principals are saying, yes, this is a problem in my school, but I don't really know what to do about it. And national literature is saying, essentially, we don't know how to offer PD around this, right? So this is a big problem, but we aren't really talking about it in the ways that we should. We also know that for districts, there are many costs, some financial, some otherwise, to having large numbers of student mobility. So in SLPS, there is a large transportation budget, and some of that is a result of students moving between schools or students who are living outside the district but still attending school here. So mobility really does have an influence at every level of the education system, and especially for a large district like SLPS. There are reasons why studying student mobility is particularly impactful. So as we go through the local and state data, there are two major ways that we want you to think about this. And it's that student mobility is first a shared challenge. It is across the city of St. Louis. It is shared by every school. And by tonight, by coming and sharing about what we know right now. So this is not the end. This is the beginning of the beginning. There are many more phases of this research to come, but thinking about what is it that we know about student mobility gives us the opportunity to have a shared understanding so we can actually talk about it. We know that people refer to mobility in a lot of different ways. We know that there are many definitions of mobility, but by using the same language, using the same data, we can actually start to address it. We also know that student mobility is a policy problem. Again, practitioners are saying, please help. And so as policymakers or people who are influential to policymakers, we want to talk about some of those aspects of student mobility that tie directly to policy. And so again, by creating the shared understanding and using the shared data around student mobility, we can start to shape our understanding of the issue here. And that allows us to shape our understanding and possibilities for solutions. And so as we go through the St. Louis data, you'll see some comparisons regionally and across the state, but thinking about it from these two perspectives. This is a shared challenge for everybody in the city of St. Louis, and it's also a policy problem that we need to address at that level. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the Student Mobility Project or other aspects of the SRPC. And if there are any. Okay. Dr. Childress.
Thank you, Ms. Rhodey Collins. So I am the Director of Data Analytics for the CPN and work closely with a couple of schools in St. Louis Public School District. In that I work closely with practitioners. I serve on both the data committee and the student mobility committees on the SRPC, sort of as an advocate, I would say, for practitioners with someone with a data experience and also who works closely in the school building day to day. Can really be a voice for practitioners in that group as well. Hopefully will serve as sort of a data translator and going through some of the data slides with you tonight. So I'll start by defining those key terms. And so when we talk about student mobility, we're talking about the phenomenon of a student changing schools. And so it's really that process and that shift and that movement. When we talk about the transfer rate or the mobility rate, that is that numeric value that describes what is happening. And so the transfer rate is typically just the transfers in or the transfers out. And it's calculated by dividing that number over any, the number of new enrollments or the number of withdrawals over the total enrollment for a school. So for example, if a school has 100 new enrollments, their overall enrollment is 200, then that that transfer rate is 50%. The mobility rate is that combination of the transfers in and the transfers out over the total enrollment. So to look at that more closely, this is a snapshot of DESE's data dashboard about mobility rate specifically. So you can see that there's a definition at the top there. And this data is from the year 2018-19 specifically. And the fall enrollment, that 19,700 plus the additional enrollment, that 1,500, a little over 1,500, is the overall enrollment for the year. So that 46% mobility rate is calculated by dividing the 9,800 or so transfers in and out over that overall enrollment. Okay, so just again to frame the discussion in the big picture around student mobility about the data. So Dr. Williams did note that this is a pilot study. It is in its infancy. The data that is shared tonight in all of the charts is really just descriptive data from DESE and really just provides some context to what is happening and really the issues that practitioners are bringing up in the schools and what they're seeing happen. So the data is meant to frame that. Just a summary of overall what was seen during the 2018-19 school year from that DESE data. 3/4, so 75% of public schools in St. Louis City had more instances, of students transferring out than transferring in when you look at that data closely. And half of all schools in the city had 37% or more of their student population transfer in or out after the start of the school year. So I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers. I will give time for questions. So this is just a few notes. I know there's a lot of text on this slide. So this is a few notes about the process, the data visualization process. So it was how the data was downloaded. So you can go and find this data yourself. It's all publicly available data from DESE's website. And it's building level data, And there's some notes about how the data was kind of sorted, organized, and cleaned for the purposes of the data visualizations that you're seeing tonight. So this is a box plot, which represents the distribution of student mobility rates for all of the schools in St. Louis City during that same 2018-19 school year. So 2 slides ago, when I referred to that 37% of students transferring during the year, this is a visual representation of those same numbers. And so you can see again that half of St. Louis City schools had 37% or more of their students transfer in or out at the start of the school year. And we can see that by that middle line in the box is that median number. The bottom line, excuse me, of the box is the 20, where the bottom, excuse me, but the bottom of the line to the line that forms the bottom of the box is that bottom 25% of that distribution of schools. So within that box, we see 50% of the distribution of schools, and that's their student mobility rates, essentially. So what this shows us is that if we have a school with approximately 350 students, anywhere from 74 to 179 of those students are changing schools during a typical school year. Yes, question.
Does your data show that they're changing schools from one district to another or within the district?
So that is something that this doesn't show and doesn't get at, and is really purely descriptive and kind of high level, building level, and more granular data at the student level is something that would show us that. And I would say it's a charge for the SRPC and some of the further research that will happen. Any other questions before I move on? Yes, Ms. Parks.
Doesn't like me. Okay, so can you give us clarity on the difference between transferring in versus enrollment? Does that mean 2 different things?
Yes, so thank you for asking that question. As someone who works and looks at data all day, it's just like, I didn't think that just defining the enrollment, that's very useful. So the enrollment is just the overall number of students who were at that school at any point during the year. So if a student attended a school for 10 days, they still are counted in that overall enrollment. The same way that a student who attended the entire year is, each of those is one enrollment count. Any other questions?
Question.
Yes.
I know you referenced homelessness. Recently, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, foster care was removed from homelessness. And as the liaison for foster care and homelessness, the foster care students seem a little more mobile than my homeless. And what I mean by that is a lot of times their fake placements fall through because of behavior concerns or what have you. So in a given school year, and I'm just referencing one case, I had a student to move 8 times. And so I'm wondering, what audience are you solely focused on homeless, or are you looking at foster care as well?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think that is more of what we want to really dig a little bit deeper into in the discussion portion that Mr. Hartman will lead. But to give a brief answer to that question, this data doesn't capture that at all. That's one of the things that, again, that we really would like to be accomplished by the SRPC in the longer term research. And so what this data looks at is the number or the percentage of students who are moving. It doesn't look at the number of times that they move, because we do see that happen in several different cases in different situations that a student moves out of, they leave a school and go to another school, And then they come back to the same school at times, or students leave schools and come back to other schools year over year. And so for any individual student, there may be several instances of transfer for that student. We are not capturing that in any of the data visualizations that you're seeing here tonight, but it is something that we definitely should talk more about. Any other questions?
And I was just going to add, so for state reporting, the state does not require documenting, although we flag foster care as being identified. For state reporting, it does not capture that. And because of ESSA, foster care students have the right to similar services as homeless. But in the law, it requires us, anytime a foster care student changes placements, we have to conduct what's called a best interest determination meeting. And so the purpose of the meeting is to provide these students with stability. Because if you have 8 placements in one school year, and we're not making child-centered and best interest decisions, certainly these students would have no sense of community. So that's the piece I like about the law, that we get to look at it, and the goal is to offer them stability. School is the only place we can do it.
Absolutely. And again, I think that speaks to one of the larger goals of the SRPC is to really sometimes, and again, I know this from experience as a researcher, you can just look at data and not have the context around that data, not have a full picture of what those numbers mean. And a great benefit of this group is that you have the practitioners not only working closely with researchers, but really practitioners are driving the questions and really directing what is done with the data and what is looked at. So again, great question, great points. And then I will move to the first chart we have here. So this is again box plots, but this is giving a brief picture of how St. Louis compares to surrounding counties. And so as we know, St. Louis City and St. Louis County are separate counties. And so we have a box to represent each of those, but then we also have box plots here to represent the student mobility rate distribution in Franklin County, Jefferson County, and St. Charles County as well. And essentially what we're seeing, again, that range. So 2 things I think to take away. So St. Louis City is that blue box that we see that is second from the right. And that top of the box represents essentially the top rate, student mobility rate for 75% of schools in the city. That middle line is the median mobility rate. So that essentially everything below that is the distribution for 50% of the schools in the district. And so a key takeaway when I look at this is that 50% of our schools in St. Louis City have higher mobility rates than 75% of schools in every other one of the counties shown here on this chart. And then I'll let you all just kind of take in this chart and this data for a few more moments and see if you have any questions. When I see eyes, I'll move ahead to the next chart. Okay. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Burton.
I'm just wondering if this data takes into account school size or the number of schools in a district?
You know what, that's a really good question as well. So again, this is really just descriptive, and it really is just kind of what is gathered, downloaded from DESE, and is providing a visual representation of that data. And so it's doesn't necessarily account for in a statistical sense in terms of like controlling for. It doesn't do any of those things with the different sizes. And so it simply is just really the range of mobility rates for each of these. And so that bigger box is likely also, the size of the box is in part just that a school district may, or excuse me, a county in this case may have more schools in that. But the rates really is the big takeaway. So no matter the size of the county or the number of schools in any particular district that's represented, those are still kind of the middle range of mobility rates. And so it gives us kind of just that general idea of what we're looking at in terms of mobility. Hopefully does that answer your question?
Well, to piggyback off of that, some of these counties, like a Hazelwood, you typically have to go to the school that you are assigned. Where in a school district like St. Louis Public Schools, you can choose. So I would be curious to compare it to districts that look more like that, opposed to the restrictions that other districts may or may not have.
Yeah, absolutely. Another good point. I'm excited hearing that, because again, that's one of the things that we would like to happen in the longer term research, is to really look at school type, choice versus non-choice, and see how those impact the patterns that we're seeing in this data. So in the interest of time, I'll move along. So what this next slide shows is really essentially the same thing, but it's looking at that trend over time. So we're just looking at the median mobility rate, which is that middle line, all of the same regions. So St. Louis City and surrounding counties. And that top line you can see is St. Louis City. And we have data represented from 2010 to 2019 here. We chose to focus on 2018-19 school years. As we know, in 2020, things got a little different in terms of the pandemic and how that impacted things. And so we do see some kind of wild changes in the data there. And again, another task for the SRPC to really dig into that deeper and see what happened to students during that time. But even though the mobility rate has declined steadily over the last 10 years or so, we still see that it's much higher than the surrounding counties.
And of course, it goes back to the McKinney-Vento law. So not only was foster care removed from that piece of the law, so was transitional housing. And so like our numbers appear to be declining. It doesn't mean that the population went somewhere, but that piece of the law changed. And so folk who are highly mobile and living in quote unquote stable housing through transitional housing, and usually it's a 2-year time frame as opposed to a 30-day shelter. And so those are just points I encourage you to factor in as you look at your data.
Absolutely. And that's the kind of feedback that we need. And that's why we wanted this to be a dialogue. So thank you for that comment. So the next chart is similar to the first one. However, in this case, it's showing how St. Louis City compares to similar size metro areas. And so the way that this is broken out, we see Columbia metro area represented, Kansas City and Kansas City metro area represented in different box plots on this chart, and then Springfield metro area, and then, St. Louis City again. And what we can see here is that St. Louis City, the mobility rate distribution for St. Louis City is more similar to Kansas City, still a bit higher. We see that middle range is about 40% roughly for St. Louis City, and it's just over 30% for Kansas City. Not surprising, I'm sure, as you know, Kansas City has also kind of looked into and been interested in looking to student mobility. And not surprising when you see that kind of the data. And so I know what happens is that practitioners are seeing this, but really I think that this picture of the data really frames what practitioners know is happening. And then I'll advance to the next slide and give a chance for questions after this. So again, similar slide, same data. This is the comparison again to similarly sized metro areas, but over time again here. And what we see again is that, so that top green line is Kansas City, the top pinkish or purplish line is St. Louis City. And again, there's some overlap there for who's had the highest mobility rate over time. However, those mobility rates, even though they've declined over time, are still pretty high. We can see in 2019, it was over 30% in St. Louis City, that median middle mobility rate, excuse me. Any questions about those two slides? Okay. So I know the next slide looks like a lot. However, it is simply a review, I guess you can say, of what we have already talked about and seen. This is all of the regions that we have seen in the previous charts, all in one place. And so it really just gives that picture of that student mobility distribution again, with all of the surrounding counties and the similarly sized metro areas. Again, that purple box second to the right, St. Louis City, we can see still has the highest mobility rates. Those dots above the box are outliers. So that might represent, some of the schools where if we're taking a bit more time, and as we get further into the study, we can distinguish between certain schools within the distribution that may look different for specific reasons. But the overall picture still shows that there's fairly high mobility rates. And then again, similar picture, all of the regions in the previous charts, all in one place, but over time, again, so from 2010, to 2019, those school years, again, we see that pattern with St. Louis City still falling with some of the highest mobility rates among all of these localities. So just to give a quick overview, again, I know I went through a bit of data pretty quickly. Just to go back to Ms. Rhodey Collins' review of the data previously, the research that has been done nationally shows that student mobility harms students who leave. They have a harder time after making that transition, but there's also some sort of harmful impact to students who stay in that classroom overall. And however you look at the data, St. Louis City schools have higher student mobility rates relative to surrounding counties and to similarly sized metro areas. And the great question was asked about the incidences of mobility. That's something that we don't really know. That we know that that's something that probably is reflected in school data, but for the building level DESE data that was visualized here, we don't know what those individual incidences of mobility look like. So now I'll pause again to ask if there's any questions about the data portion of that before giving Mr. Hartman a chance to lead you in discussion.
I recognize this is from 30,000 feet up, but I like the data to drill down, school by school, LEA by LEA. I think there's data of daily attendance and enrollment. And I know there are patterns that we have seen as a practitioner where some of the named LEAs will jettison students just before MAP testing, for example. I'm not sure that's captured in any of this. And I'm not throwing this at you. It's just a concern I have to, I really want real data that drills a little deep. And I think that data is there, daily attendance and enrollment. Even if we broke it down by quarter, it would be useful to know if there's a pattern that in December or springtime, it was higher than other times. But thank you for your portion of the presentation.
Thank
It's
you.
just a comment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that comment. And Dr. Williams, correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, I'm taking notes and giving this to the SRPC researchers as a task to actually do. Okay, awesome. So I've heard from Rachel that they actually are looking at that already. Wonderful.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to Byron's point. You know, a lot of times after the holidays or kids are on break, our numbers spike. And so that's certainly something, to his point, to consider.
Any other questions, comments? All right, Mr. Hartman, thank you for your time.
Evening, everyone. Thank you. I agree. Great question from Mr. Clemens. And it's actually a good segue. So you'll see that this is already part of the planned future work of the SRPC, which is good, hopefully. But we also want to get feedback from you all. I'll start by saying thank you for being here and serving on this committee. It's nice, especially like talking about such an important topic such as student mobility, to see all of you all showing up for kids even after hours. So knowing that your stated priorities as a committee have been to focus on local funding and unpack trauma and how it impacts students, and explicitly talking about housing insecurity, it's just an honor to be able to share some of this with you and hope that it can be helpful. So again, thank you, and thank you for being here and allowing us to share. So we've talked a little bit about the limitations of the data. And so these are questions that are ongoing research questions that the SRPC team is working on. So these are some things that we don't know yet, but we want to drill down deeper into. What are the specific patterns of movement? So like, where are folks going? What's happening between districts and LEAs in and out of the city? Does mobility look different for different students? Is there a certain profile that is different? If so, how? Why are families moving? This is like a really important qualitative question. What leads to them to transfer in and out? So hopefully these questions are resonating and are worthy of continued study. How can schools, this is a question I want to know as a practitioner, how can schools impact the negative effects of mobility? We've heard that there isn't a lot of great best practice, and we know that from national studies, but I think it's worth us digging into here in the local context. And then, has student mobility changed significantly due to COVID? You notice that the data only went to 2019 that we shared. It gets very noisy after 2019, and there are significant drops, but those are, as was alluded to earlier, those are as a result of policies changing during COVID, both internally in the district as well as in the city. And so those are worth exploring further. And so the research group intends to do just that. They want to do qualitative study about why families are moving and why they're staying. And then what are the best practices to alleviate the negative effects, as well as take a detailed look at a month-by-month mobility for individual students and their outcomes in St. Louis schools. So I think this is really important. To Mr. Clemens' question is the month-by-month, the dynamic nature of the mobility. And so if this committee was interested in seeing more of that drilled down data, there's a potential to do more of this work and look at the school by school data in the future as more of the research results come in. And that's something that I feel personally in my day job, is that month to month constant revolving door of students. So also a regional analysis, city, county, what are the 10-year, 15-year trends of students moving back and forth from city and county schools? And then finally, developing some maps so that the data can be even more visually appealing. So I want to encourage you all to ask questions, but I will start by just saying, a little bit about like our why and my why for this is my day job works closely with 2 SLPS schools, and I've stood before the school board before and had to account for student outcomes. And I have stood at this lectern and said, it's hard to talk about student outcomes if we're not acknowledging the impacts of student mobility. And it is tempting to throw your hands in the air and say, those things are directly connected. And I think they are connected, but I also think it's really important to like dig into where does student mobility impact student outcomes, where doesn't it? Right? And I think that's, so I'm excited that you're willing to dig into that. So again, thank you. But we can't just say this isn't a phenomenon that is out of our control. We know it largely is, but are there things we can do internally in the school? And then how can we overlap between practitioners and policymakers? You guys are sitting there with a position and an ability to raise this and advocate for kids in schools. And so I want to revisit this really quickly. This demonstrates the snapshot of mobility rate, 46%. That is an incredibly big number. Imagine this group of people. There's about 20 of us in here. If this was a classroom, that means that over the course of the year, at least 10 of the 20 are leaving, but then they're being backfilled by other students. And then among those new 10, some of them are leaving, and then others are being filled. And as a teacher, maybe I'm a third grade teacher who is really cares about getting my kids on grade level, because statistically, I know that by third grade, if they're not on grade level, then their future isn't as bright as we want it to be. And the kids are coming in and out. It is really difficult to build relationships, to build lasting, trusting relationships, and to teach them how to read in the time that it takes. And so that's the reality of this work. And I hope that we want to support the district in digging into this further, and we hope that we can help. So I'll start with, do you have any clarifying questions?
Before we do have 3 celebrity guests in the audience. First of all, Lakeisha Robinson, who is the Mayor's Senior Advisor for Children, Youth, and Families. Lakeisha is here because she's going to help us fix all this. And
thank you. Yes.
Aisha Bailey, do I have that right? From National AFT happens to be here. Aisha, sorry. I wasn't even close. Aisha Baldwin. From National AFT, and of course, Mr. President, Ray Cummings. Dr. Crapo, you're a celebrity too. So Dr. Crapo, Assistant Superintendent of Implementation. Anyway, so thank you.
Yep.
And so I wanted to welcome you guys to ask questions as well.
Yes, and Ms. Vinoy, I told her earlier, I might put her on the spot to ask a question too, because she knows this data as well as anyone.
Mr. Hartman,
Yes, ma'am.
what is the timeline for the study? Because I like seeing where you're headed. Because you answered some of my questions when I saw that chart that said some of the other things you were gathering.
Yep.
But how long do you think this timeline would be?
So my colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong,
Rachel's
but
like-
to set expectations on what everything that is on slide 30,
Okay.
which is the one that has like, these are the further slides.
Yes.
It's going through the whole academic process. It's rigorous research. So the institutions have to get IRB approval, and they have, in order to like do qualitative studies. So
Right.
that they also have to get the right data, and they have to get it clean. So we're talking the ongoing thing. We're talking, over the course of this academic year.
Okay.
I think is is likely realistic. But we also want to hear feedback from you all. Are there things we can do in the meantime? You know, this is an example of something we can try to do in the meantime. This is
Yeah.
descriptive data. It's not all the answers, and there are ongoing answers yeah.
Thank you.
Did I get the timeline okay?
Yeah, so it's been already in the process up till this point. All of the data submissions have gone through. We're still waiting on that final data to be
Okay.
getting back from the state. And then the qualitative research is going to be starting in the next month or so, since they've not gone through it again, all the bureaucratic processes.
And are you aware of anyone else that's doing a deeper dive like this?
Kansas City did one, I don't remember how long ago. And so they sent us their research as well. And I know they've talked to some people and explored it and you know some session and option.
And I will add that it's a uniquely St. Louis and Kansas City challenge in the state
Yes.
of Missouri, as the data demonstrated, and the way that other states track mobility data is not necessarily the same as Missouri. So that part of this process of asking these questions has elevated some of those challenges. And so, yeah, great question.
I just have a clarifying question, just the slide after discussion where we got the 46.4%. Does that include the other named LEAs in that data, or is this St. Louis Public Schools we're talking about?
This is just SLPS.
Thank you.
Yep. So on the box plot slides, when it says St. Louis City, those include all schools. And this is specifically when you look up SLPS on DESI's dashboard, this is the 2019 data. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it'd be
Thank
good
you.
to mark that.
Yeah.
Hey, good evening. You touched on something that made me think that maybe the mobility is like the tip of the iceberg of what this really is.
Yes.
Because at Sumner, it's not just the kids in and out that affect the building of a relationship with a child to where you could affect and then you use that relationship to help them. It's sometimes like the kid having clean clothes, the kid is babysitting for a family member, healthcare. Sometimes with other kids, it's translation issues that they're doing for their parents. So like, how are you planning on putting, the external factors that keep the kid out of what are the other external factors that we can implement and that the kid keeps the kid out of school, that maybe it looks like mobility, but it's not mobility? Because I have a kid who has been 14 absences out of a class, but it's not a mobility issue, maybe DJO, whatever the issue is.
So that's a great question. I think it builds on what Ms. Thomas Murray asked too about the difference between homeless designation, foster care designation. Mobility is much more than just homelessness, but it is that too. And so identifying the characteristics of students that are mobile, like specific characteristics of that, is something that when we look at school level data, right, not publicly reported DESI data, but school level data, we can start to build that out and then hopefully use that to advocate.
Clarify for a minute. So what I mean by this is the fact that a kid will not come to school because they don't have clean clothes. That doesn't mean that they're not mobile, or that doesn't mean that they're mobile. They have a place to live. And they don't have a place to do the laundry.
Yeah.
And
I was thinking about the language translation piece that you mentioned. So in how I answered it, but I don't necessarily, I think that's a great question and I don't have anything to respond to. Please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Chad. I'm also helping with the research here. And, what you're describing is something that we are hearing from practitioners once we share the data, right? So one thing that folks at KIPP said is, yeah, my kids aren't necessarily moving. They're not moving school. They're just not coming to school for 14 days. And because of state law, I have to say that they are out of school, and they have to re-enroll. And so what you're describing there, I think, is a good example of the nuance that is needed, that bi-directional relationship that we have together, so that we can actually correctly and accurately predict what is actually happening versus what we just see on this website.
And add to that, with the student level data, if that will be a part of the conversation too, because you'll see a student who's unenrolled in the school and then re-enrolled in the school at the same time period. And for that should be a flag. There's something else going on. But we can't see that with public data. That requires the researchers to dive in and have access to that really detailed student level data.
Yeah, and I was just gonna point out, we haven't referenced behavior. And I was just quite surprised, you know, I'm from New Orleans, and when I would hear parents say, oh, we're moving to the county. And the trailing part is their children were struggling with behavior. And there's this magical thinking that, like, I'm in a meeting about a week ago, and they said, well, maybe let's just give the kid a fresh start. Well, geographics doesn't change behavior. And I think we keep missing the problem, what the real problem is. But it's 7 o'clock, I think, somewhere.
Mr. Burton?
Well, and maybe I'm just reading into this, but because all those things are true and all those things impact instruction. But I thought, maybe I'm wrong, but the reason we were starting with this notion of mobility is because mobility is trauma. Mobility impacts culture. Mobility drives inequity, and mobility is driven by inequities, right? And so it seems like if we start to touch this, we get to touch all those other things, and that's why it's a launching point. But maybe I was reading into it.
I think that's a great interpretation.
Oh.
Well, my question really is kind of twofold. Like, what do you feel like currently are the barriers or challenges to really accomplish what you have up there? Because I think you guys have done great work. And then, like, what supports are you lacking at this to achieve what the future has coming up, or what you guys have?
Yeah. No, so just to repeat the question, what are some of the challenges and what are supports that are needed? I think that you guys have done a great job of laying out some of the challenges, and I want to put this question onto this committee of, like, what are the supports, or what is the committee looking to do to advocate for this? I could share it, but these guys are the ones making the decisions, and so that's actually kind of the next question, which is what is actionable, but also what feedback do you have? And I'll get to the last question because we can just have an open discussion. But how can we be supportive? Or how could this data be supportive of your goals? I can answer it personally as somebody who's practicing in schools, and I think quickly the characteristics that are listed. There should be different levels of funding. This is Jay Hartman answering this question, but this is different levels of funding geared towards schools that need more support and students that have demonstrated that they need more support. So. But I would ask this group that question too.
I would say, I can't be up here and not talk about families, right?
Yeah, please.
And communities. But I would say the biggest challenge is, I believe we've gotten away from being an inclusive environment for our families to hear their voice. We were trying to say, well, why are they moving? We can look at those external things all day, but at one point we just talked to the families, and if we had those relationships and we built that trust there, maybe they will stay. Maybe even if they don't, maybe we'll at least get a better understanding of why they're moving. And then we can determine, is this a SLPS concern, or is this outside of our scope? Can we look to our government officials? Is it a community issue? Is it community support? I think we do a lot of great work being very reactive, but until we build the trust and create the positive relationships, whether it's a teacher to student, teacher to parent, teacher to guardian relationship, then we're probably going to continue to see these trends. But I think there's just a lot of distrust. And then, of course, I always blame things on capitalism. People have to survive. And so they're going to do whatever they can to survive. And sometimes getting my child to school that day may or may not be on my priority list.
All these other metropolitan partners we may have out there, be that the university that I attended, which has a significant endowment, and manages to get property and do some development kind of stuff. Part of the package might be looking at affordable housing for families. Single-family houses that are affordable to people and have more than one bedroom. We've already met the needs of old white people for
yes, sir,
condominiums. Right now, we need to look at how we can help families, and public safety is a big issue for all of us. And I'm not pointing fingers and throwing rocks, but we know Maslow, we're not going to get very far if we don't address safety first, nutrition, health, for adults as well. We're traumatized as well. So it's a big issue, and mobility is a part of it, and it's certainly important for us to tackle it. But it is a big picture where there are entities out there that could come to the table and help and not just observe.
So I think the comments are they're just spot on. And we know that previous research, particularly when we look at urban communities, previous research highlights this mobility challenge. But I think we reframe this and say, I want to understand the lived experiences of the students, of the staff, of the families, of the parents, of the community. So the qualitative, the why around this work is critically important. We learned so much from the numerical statistical data shared this evening, and to Mr. Clemens' point, just high-level data, really understanding and unpacking, sitting down and talking with young people, sitting down and talking with their families to understand the why. Why do I leave? Why do I stay? What's happening that motivates my movement? And what can we do to make sure that they have the kind of supports in their community, in the schools, in just, it's an ecosystem, if you will, of wraparound services that we need to be thinking about in a very intentional way. And I think until we ask the why, we're still conjectures, right? We're still making assumptions about why I leave and why I stay. And so I really want to push us. And I know as an SRPC, we are really focused on getting to the qualitative aspect of this data. And so really ensuring that we manage expectations about what we can learn from the data set that we have before us, and then how we triangulate and bring in additional data to understand the patterns of mobility that we see in our city. I think that's critical. And I think all of my colleagues have stated that the why is so important, and the lived experiences of the student, staff, and families that are part of this work should be elevated in the conversation. So thank you. That was just my thinking as we talk about this important mission critical work.
I want to thank you guys so much. I just kind of a sort of a closing thought to sort of like, well, what are we going to do with this information? The board set up this committee in order to go to Jefferson City, to go to our legislators, to go to the Board of Aldermen, to go to city departments, to tell our story. Because just the most brazen example was we would go to Jefferson City, and it was always like, oh, the people from this failing public school district are here. And so because they would look at the test scores, they would look at stuff like that. So we put it together to tell this different story, to tell the full story, to tell the story about the kid who is having attendance issues for multiple societal reasons. And okay, their scores aren't going to be great, but what are the supports that the school district are providing them? What is the family and support specialists doing? What are the social workers doing? What is the students in transitions doing? What are the classroom teachers, the principals, everybody in, we keep using the word ecosystem, the ecosystem of our public school district, what are they actually doing? It's not failing. It's not failing at all. But what's failed is our society. What's failed is the city around us. Because if you look at those box graphs, it's disturbing. It's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. So part of it is we're going to tell our story. We're going to take the data and tell it to the people in a way that maybe the researchers can't do it. to make it meaningful for the people that are in power and making decisions. And we're going to do something about it. We're going to fix it. We're going to get them to invest in affordable housing for our families. We're going to get people to help and support with all the needs that our children have and pitch in to do it. So that's the goal of this committee. We set a legislative priority to deal with trauma and issues around homelessness. And hearing when I met with Saris, I don't remember when it was, and she was telling me about this and her idea for this research. I knew that this was going to plug in eventually, and we said November. We're in October, and so we know you'll be back with more information. But I'm just so grateful for this work to be started. Like Dorothy said, we need this information because we need to explain it to people in black and white exactly what's happening, why it's happening, so we can come up with solutions, because we have to do this.
Yep. Well, thank you all.
So before the committee leaves, I have 5 minutes of actual committee work. Just really quickly, everyone is welcome to stay, but we just have to go over our legislative priorities really quickly, if that's all right.
Again, Mr. Davis, we just want to take a moment and thank you. Thank you for your vision and bringing us to this forum this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so just really quickly, everybody has a copy of our legislative platform that changes a little bit every now and then. This is the legislative platform from the next from last year. Cheryl, I don't have the clicker. If you could advance. These were our 3 legislative priorities last year. My suggestion is we keep 2 and 3 and we change number 1 because we won for the time being. So if we go to the next slide. So we have talked about it at a legislative meeting in, when was that, July, when we presented to some of the legislators at our legislative breakfast with Vashon. Also, at the ending of Linda Quinley from MSBA's presentation about the efficiency studies, one of her recommendations was in line with our recommendation that we were talking about with the legislator. So my suggestion would be to replace number 1 with something along this line, to include that we would support a community need feasibility studies for any new or expanded schools in the city of St. Louis. And what that looks like is sort of laid out in those 4 bullet points. Now, the legislative priorities and platforms are generalized. The devil's always in the details, but that would be my suggestion. Any thoughts or questions about that? Okay. All right, next slide. I want to add I would suggest that we add 2 particular things, and this is kind of based on recent conversations. This was also language that we actually did not adopt last year, but we did sort of formulate last year. So if we go to page 2 under support, taxes, and TIFs, we do have legislation that requires equal representation and unanimous support. That actually was introduced last year. I forget the Senate bill by Lauren Arthur. I think it was introduced a year before. So that's a common, what we have on 2 that's existing is common. So I suggest that we leave that in. I would also suggest that we use the language on this first bullet point about collaboration with the city of St. Louis in revitalization efforts that will benefit district students and families. We've had excellent conversations with SLDC. They're working on multiple projects to sort of do internal reforms. And I am very happy with the relationship we've been developing with them. We met with Neil Richardson at Sumner on Monday, and another great meeting with him. I would suggest that we have very positive language about supporting this collaboration, because we are moving in that direction. It doesn't always feel like it. I know, Byron, but it is happening. It is slow. It is historic, and we'll keep pushing it. Ray, we've talked about this, but I would suggest that. And then the second one is we need to be more specific. And I do think they are going in this direction, but supporting an ordinance capping tax incentives in certain areas, because there needs to be more equity and transparency in the way that they do it. So
absolutely agree.
Thank you.
I'd also like to invite people to Adams School on Monday at 6:30. We have a nationally recognized expert on TIFs and tax abatements. You're invited.
Any thoughts about adding these to the taxes and TIFs? Yes, sir, Mr.
Just
Burton.
one question. Are we, in this slide here, are we talking about maybe adding community benefit agreements to TIF proposals or no? Is this where we're leaning or?
So I would include that in the number one, but not specifically saying community benefits agreement because that language gets tricky.
Okay.
So we're leaving it generic. We've had some sort of informal community benefits conversations in the last couple months. But we got tricked up just recently, not to get too far into the weeds, with formalizing something because it depends on how the bill comes through at the Board of Aldermen or through the different city agencies that are authorized to do this in different ways. So I found that language can sometimes be a little difficult. So I would include that in number one. In my mind, it's in number one. Yeah. Any other thoughts about these two? Okay, we're in agreement. Next slide. I have one other, just to point out two other things. If you look on page 3 under funding, if you go to the bullet point number 4, and I'm not sure if Steve's still on here, but I would suggest we're going to have to tweak that language a little bit because any amendment to the Missouri Constitution has probably a non-factor anymore regarding vouchers because of the Supreme Court decision. So it's not the prohibition of going to religious entities doesn't seem to be a factor anymore, which was why that Missouri Constitution there. So we'll probably have to tweak that because it will be the year of the voucher next year in the legislative session. And then I also do want to point out, we don't have it in here, but the board did adopt language regarding opposing any legislation that affects teachers. I call it opposing teacher and librarian censorship. We adopted language in there, so I would suggest we leave that in there as well.
I would agree with you, Matt.
Okay. Mr. Carroll, you're unmuted. Do you want to say anything?
No, I just would agree with you on that. Obviously, there's a couple other bullet points that I might think that we should add to our legislative package moving forward for next year. I don't know if now is the time to talk about it.
I'm sorry, we're not catching you. I apologize.
You can't hear me?
We'll talk.
Hello?
Yeah, so with the caveat, I think what Mr. Carroll is saying is that there may be some additions or subtractions, but we want to go ahead and put this in. My suggestion for the next meeting is, I'll talk to Steve, but before the end of the year, we'll have him present with sort of a forecast of what to look forward on for next year. So that may require us to change some things, and we'll probably do that by Zoom if possible, because those kind of meetings work better by Zoom. So are there any other questions or thoughts about the legislative platform or priority?
Just a clarifying point, Mr. Davis, you talking about the language opposing censorship is how are we going to integrate that into?
We adopted specific, the
Yes.
board adopted specific language. It's just not included in this document.
And that's what we're gonna
Because we
include.
adopted it during the legislative session, not before. So we never changed this document.
Got it.
So I was just saying, let's keep that language because we've already worked through it and it's pretty much going to be evergreen for a while.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, if there are any other thoughts, we will incorporate those recommendations for the board to vote on, and we are adjourned.